Hello friends, today let's see how the Renaissance died. Welcome to the Eye of History, where we talk about all things map and map collecting. Maps are our window into history. History not just of places, but ideas, economics, technologies, and people. If you enjoy this sort of content, please like, subscribe, and share. The algorithm must be fed. Before we get too deep into this, we should probably define what we mean by the Renaissance. Now, the term is often used to denote an entire era, but that's sloppy thinking. The Renaissance was actually an intellectual movement, and one in which the Latin and Greek classics were exalted, particularly in areas like sculpture and architecture, but really in all areas of endeavor. The writers of the Enlightenment portrayed the Renaissance as a break with the brutish medieval era, but that grossly underestimates the accomplishments of medieval Europe. And it ignores the deficiencies of the Renaissance. We'll see today how the Renaissance, like most intellectual movements, had its weaknesses and overstayed its welcome. You don't have to be an expert to recognize a Renaissance era map. The Renaissance was about exalting, copying, and adapting from the classical masters. And in cartography, there was one such master, Claudius Ptolemaeus, or Ptolemy of Alexandria. You may know him as the astronomer par excellence, but in the 2nd century AD, he also wrote the seminal work on map making, known as the Geographia. It was a manual for how to make maps. It discussed how to find latitudes and longitudes, discussed the problems of projecting the spherical Earth onto flat maps. Ptolemy's own solution was something very close to our modern conical projection. It also had an incredible index, an index to an atlas that Ptolemy himself created, but which did not survive. The index included latitudes and longitudes for over 6,000 places, notes describing seas and rivers and mountain ranges, everything that the Renaissance mapmaker needed to reconstruct his atlas, notwithstanding that those 6,000 locations, most of those were now dust. And of course, the Renaissance mapmakers set to work reconstructing that atlas. Note that the Geographia was known in late medieval times, and in fact they did make reconstructions of Ptolemy's atlas. The medievals were not so ignorant of Ptolemy, but they were not so devoted to Ptolemy like the Renaissance mapmakers were. And also, those medieval mapmakers were working before the printing press. But with the advent of the printing press, interest exploded. For printers, it was a recipe for quick profits. Your typical man of Verona could not afford a marble bust or a painting from a Renaissance master, but he could afford to show his refinement with a nice printed map mounted on his wall, perhaps colored by hand. The accuracy of the map didn't matter, only that it was the work of a classical master. Now, the map I'm showing on the screen right now is just such a map. Now, this one's not colored. Extra credit if you can figure out what it's supposed to represent. Not that it really mattered much to our man of Verona, who was not likely to ever visit this region. Almost none of the cities on this map were still in existence when it was printed. But it looks pretty smart. Latitudes and longitudes, some climate theory, even some little inset text with some scholarly details. I will do a video on this map in the near future. It is one of my favorites. In 1540, a certain Swiss cartographer made his own reconstructions of these maps, and he had them printed under the unimaginative name, the Geographia. But to the 20-plus Ptolemaic maps, our Sebastian Munster added a similar number of maps of his own creation, including today's map. And just like that, the Renaissance was over. Now, my map is not from the original 1540 printing. It is from a 1552 edition. If you're not familiar with the subject, Franconia is in central Germany, It's a fairly hilly region, drained by the main river and its main tributary, the Regnitz. We see these rivers here. Here's the Main, crossing in an east-west direction. Here's the Regnitz through Nuremberg. You might recognize a few of these places. I'll zoom in a little bit. Nuremberg, here's Bamberg. Here's Würzburg, or I believe that's now Wurzburg. Pardon my terrible German. One of the fun parts about collecting old maps is just deciphering some of the old names. Now, if you know your German geography, you'll have noticed the first odd thing about this map. North is at the bottom, south is on the top. Now, this was something of an innovation. Ptolemy was an astronomer, and naturally, as an astronomer, he oriented his maps towards the North Star. Munster's Ptolemaic maps followed that North Star orientation, but his own maps varied. Munster was probably working from sketches made by his friends and colleagues, his sources for this map information. Munster did not survey Franconia himself. Now, let's zoom in a little bit more, get some first impressions. So, it's definitely artistically drawn. It has kind of that Lord of the Rings feel to it, with the little pictures of the towns and castles, the little bits of forest drawn in. Now, this is a woodcut, where they started with a flat block of wood and removed all the places where they didn't want ink. Now, this is obviously a very painstaking process, and it puts some serious limits on the level of detail you can get. You'll notice that the text looks very different in character from the rest of the map. That's because the text was not cut out of the wood. It was actually metal type that was lodged into the wooden block. So it was added after the rest of the map was already carved out. You'll notice that the text is often awkwardly spaced. It's not always in a nice straight line. There are places where it's abbreviated or broken up. That's because the text was put in after the map was entirely drawn. So they often had to cram it in however they could. It's imperfect, but it's hard to imagine Munster and his crew carving into wood every little umlaut and descender. Now, this is interesting to me. You'll notice on the top and on the sides, you have these grid coordinates. This is something that Ptolemy suggested belonged on maps, and Munster still respected the classics enough to include this on his map. The odd thing is that they're never used. Munster's atlas did not have any kind of index. There was no text to it at all. It was simply the maps themselves. So these grid coordinates are completely unused. So at least in this respect, Munster's break with the Renaissance is incomplete. Now, Munster also encouraged the use of a scale. And sure enough, here in the lower right, we see a scale. I'll zoom in a bit so we can see. Come on over here. And we have a scale in German miles. Now, what is a German mile, you ask? Well, it's about 24,000 German feet. What is a German foot? Well, that depends on where the German is standing. In some locations, it could be less than 11 inches. At some locations, it can be more than 14 inches. So we'll never know just exactly how long each of Munster's miles is on this map. We can't even take for granted that it'll match the same German miles on any of his other maps. Which brings up the question of just how accurate is this map? So I fired up Google Earth, plotted a few of the landmarks from this map on the Google Earth map, and came up with something like this. Now, at first glance, it looks not too far off. I did a little measuring. I assumed Munster was using a 12-inch foot, which makes his German mile a little less than 5 modern miles, about 7.5 kilometers. And I was able to make a few comparisons. For example, from Bamberg to Nuremberg, on Munster's map, it's about 41 kilometers. In real life, it's about 50 kilometers. So off about 20%. From Bamberg to Würzburg, Munster has about 68 kilometers. Real life, it's about 70. So it ranges from off up to about 20% to dead on. And of course, that's with kind of a guess on what his German mile really is, which means it's not so far off that it would have caused any hardship to a traveler on foot or on horseback in that time. But it's clearly not based on actual surveys. Now, the idea of using surveying tools for anything more than drawing property lines was really new at this point in time. Some people were experimenting with church steeples, triangulating between them to get the lay of the land, so to speak. Now, that only works if you can see multiple church steeples from wherever you're standing, which is not the case in a hilly region like Franconia. So Munster could not take advantage of that, though we do see that in some maps appearing in the Low Countries around this time. Now, back to our map. One thing we're used to on a modern map is standardized symbols, and these symbols are not standardized. Every one of these is a little different, and it's not clear whether any particular one of these is supposed to represent a city, or a castle, or a village, or a town. There's an arbitrariness to it. Bamberg here is one of the largest cities in Franconia, and it gets one of the tiniest of symbols. Now, zooming out a little bit, the major rivers, like the Main here, and the Regnitz, these are pretty accurately drawn, but these tributaries are not. In fact, it's quite a challenge even to match up this map with Google Earth and even identify some of these tributaries. Now, of course, it was the major rivers, the navigable rivers, that would have been of interest to the buyers of these maps, not the little tributaries. Now, notice that there are no roads on this map. In fact, we rarely see roads in maps of this vintage. Now, there's two reasons for that. First of all, roads were quite impermanent. If you were traveling in Franconia, wanted to get from Nuremberg to Bamberg, you would ask around in Nuremberg to find out what road was currently the right way to get there. The second reason is this atlas was a bulky thing. It was not meant to be carried around on horseback or on foot. It was meant to stay at home, to be studied and admired at its owner's leisure. Notice also, there are no boundaries on this map. Sovereignty in this era was not a matter of established territorial states. Sovereignty was personal, embodied in the monarch, in the prince, the king, the emperor. It was often fractured and always subject to change. At this time, Franconia is part of the Holy Roman Empire, which was a patchwork of hundreds of principalities. It would have been a thankless task to try to draw those boundaries into this map. We sometimes see boundaries in maps of this vintage, but they were usually added after the fact by the colorist, and always in broad strokes. Now, one thing I find interesting is over here in the corner, we see printed in very bold type the term veteram, which is Latin for something like once again, depending on the context. Now, this is a puzzle to me, and I'd love to hear your ideas. I do not know what Munster had in mind by this term. I do not know why he put it in there. And if you have an idea, please put it in the comments. I'd really like to hear it. Now, Munster's name will never be as famous as Caravaggio, Rubens, or Rembrandt, but the Geographia represents as great a break from its predecessors as the gap between the Renaissance and the Baroque in sculpture and painting and architecture. For that, and for some other reasons, I like to describe this map using that same term, Baroque. And the following century, I like to call the Baroque era of cartography. Now, I'm the only one, this is my personal term, but I am hoping the idea will catch on. I do plan on making a video in the future, giving a more full explanation of why I think Baroque is the right term for this map and the maps like them made in the subsequent era. But for today, it suffices to say, for me personally, as a map collector, the value of this map is through the roof. Granted, the subject is not particularly important, but I'd liken it to the sort of preliminary paintings that artists like Rubens made before launching into a major project. And if you look at the art market, those sketches and miniatures, they sell for pretty good money. Honestly, the marketplace disagrees, which is why I'm never going to claim to be a great appraiser. Do not ever invest in a map on my say-so. What the marketplace is going to see is the following. It's going to see a decent impression in decent condition, but it's not colored. Now, coloring in this era was done by hand. It was done after the fact and was usually on display maps, not atlas maps like this. You do find atlas maps that are colored, but they were much less likely to get that attention. It's also from a 4th edition. This is not a Mickey Mantle rookie card situation here. Furthermore, the Geographia was quite popular, so there were thousands of copies of this map printed. And atlas maps tended to survive much longer than loose maps. So this map is still readily available, and that works against it when you're trying to appraise its market value. Now, Munster is a giant, and he's very popular to collect, but not so much for maps like this, but for maps like this. Munster's world maps, his continental maps, were flamboyantly illustrated. Just count the sea monsters on this guy. This sort of map sells for thousands of dollars. Maps like this are much cheaper. Typically a couple $100, and sometimes you can find specimens at auction for even under $100. Now, this amazes me. What other artifact can you purchase that is nearly 500 years old and had real cultural impact in its time? I've seen trinkets like livery badges sell for more than this map. To me, this smells like opportunity. With Sebastian Munster, you have the opportunity to build a first-rate collection on a budget and the chance to occasionally score big. In one estate sale, I spotted a Munster in a lot with 3 other maps. I bought the entire lot for a few $100s and thought I did well. But when I took delivery and was able to research the maps directly, I realized the Munster alone was worth several times what I paid for the whole lot. Now, I do not collect for investment purposes, but I still get excited when I have a big win like that. Ultimately, I like Munster because his maps capture an important period in history, not just of map making, but of culture in general. And it does so in a way that no book or video can duplicate. You're seeing the source material. You're looking at that era through the eyes of the people that were living in it. I think that's exciting. And if you're of like mind, and if you want to see more content like this, please remember to like, subscribe, and share. Put your comments in the section below. And check out our Eye of History channel for more videos like this.